Okay, moving on to Java tutorial number 3. We're going to go into a little bit more detail with classes, a bit more detail and depth. So let's get into that. Okay, so here we are in the class from last time. And what I want to do is just recap something. We're going to go into player.java. And I just want to recap the word this. Now you probably have seen this used in a few places, but it isn't used in other places. So you probably may be wondering, what's this.lives? What's the this sort of statement mean? Well, essentially, this refers to a variable of the class instead of a local variable passed as a parameter. Now you can see an example of this with the setLives method. It's the parameter being passed to it is called lives, but also, scrolling up, the variable for the class is called lives. So we need a way to distinguish between the variable that's in the class itself, that's defined up here in player, and also the variable that's passed to that function. So that's what this does. This is used to make it clear that we are referring to the variable that's defined in this class. So in theory, what you should do is whenever there's any chance of confusion or any risk of confusion, always use the word this. Certainly in a setter, you should always use the this to make it clear. And it's often also used in constructors as well. Now we didn't use it here in the player constructor, and that's because we've got the string called handle name, and the variables that's being passed to it is called handle. Okay, so that's what this is. I'm going to try and be a bit more consistent with that and always use it, particularly in constructors. They're the two places in theory you should always use them, and also in setters. So I'm going to change that now just to be clear, even though there's no damage this way because there's no variable here with that name. It's good just to be sort of absolute about this and remove any chance of confusion, particularly then when there's a possibility down the track that this functionality could change. For example, we might be adding additional parameters here. Okay, so that's what this statement rather is used for. Okay, now going back to the class, we talked about passing parameters, and I just want to make it clear the way that Java will help you with this. So if you set up a particular method, for example, in the player class, we set up a method called a setLevel, and it needs an integer, a whole number. Now, if we just go back and confirm that, setLevel, you can see that we're passing the integer int level. Now, if we put something that's not an integer in there, like if we put a string, this is my name to make it clearer, you can see immediately there's an error that's flagged, and it sort of says the method setLevel is the type in the type player is not applicable for the argument string. So what that's really just saying is I'm expecting an integer and you've given me a string. So use that to your advantage when you're coding to sort of look at those obvious errors and go, okay, well it's telling me I've got that wrong, so I need to change this back to a number, and then the error goes away. Okay, now we've had the concept of one parameter here. What I want to do is I want to show you how to use two parameters. So let's go back to the player class. And let's define another function right up here, just under the constructor. We're going to call it void set name and level. Set name and level. Now this is going to have two parameters because we want to set both the name and, of course, the level. So to do that, we do a string for the name and comma, and then int for the level. So this dot handle name equals name, and this dot level equals 1. Okay, so that's setting the value of name into our handle name, and it's setting the value of the class variable level to be what we've passed it, which is 1. I'm going to save that, and now if we go back, what I'm going to do is just get rid of some of this because we don't need it at the moment. We're going to clear some of this out. And what I'm going to do is get rid of that set handle name and instead do a dot set name and level. I'm going to pass that and call that Timothy and 5. So we're passing the parameters Timothy and the number 5 directly to the player class. So, and just to confirm it's what happens, set system.out.println tim.get handle name. Then on the next line, we'll also print the level. Oops. Get level. Okay, so if we run that, we get the results Timothy and the number 1. And obviously I've got something wrong. We shouldn't be getting 1, and I probably made a mistake there, which I did. It shouldn't be 1, of course. It should be the name of the variable that we're passing to it called level. So I'll save that and go back and we'll run it again. And this time we should get the correct output. Timothy and 5. Okay, so let's change this and make this a shorter name. Literally TI, 2 letters, and run that again. And our validation should kick in. But wait, it hasn't kicked in. If you recall, we set this up so if the handle name that was passed was less than 3 in length, it shouldn't be updating it. So it should return without updating it. But in this case, it has saved it. Now, why has it saved this anyway? Now, of course, the reason that it saved it is because we've hard-coded this in here. We've sort of said, this .handle name equals name right here. We haven't called any of this logic. So we haven't invoked this set handle name functionality. So we've got the functionality there ready to go, but this is bypassing it. So this is an important point when you're doing validation and so forth in classes, is to make sure that your validation does get called. So how can we check and see whether our validation is going to get called? Well, what we should be doing is really making sure that the set value should always only be updated, preferably in one spot. And whenever we need to update it, we should be calling that function directly. So what I mean is we should be doing set handle name. And even though there's no validation, we should really be doing set level level. So we're now calling these functions. And that means that this code that we've got in here, which validates the length of the string, is now going to get executed. And in the case of set level, of course, at this stage, there isn't any validation, but it still does do the save for us. So if we save that now and run it, we're now set back to unknown player, but the level is still set to 5. And of course, the reason for that is we've now executed this code, and it's in there to say that if the length is less than 3, not to save anything, just to return without updating it. And again, I can change that. Put in my name again, save it, and run it again. It now correctly saves the class, it saves the name, I should say, as Timothy. So again, it's a good habit to always ensure that if you are writing a setter, a method that is going to update a class variable, you need to make sure that's always executed, particularly when you've got validation in there. Now, just incidentally, the concept of the name and the parameters put together, that is called a method signature. So in other words, it's really what's needed to invoke that method. So that the method signature here is set name and level, string name, int level. And the other thing I just want to make clear is that it took me a while to understand this when I first got into writing object-oriented code. The class that we're creating here is the cookie cutter. Cookie cutter, or it's the template. It doesn't store any data as such. It's purely a template to be used. And if we go back to our demo.java, in here, when we've done player tim equals new player, that's creating an instance, that's creating the object. So that's using this player class as a template to create an object. So it's an important distinction between the instance, the actual object, in this case the player object with the name Tim, which has got the value handle name Timothy and level 5. That is the object or the instance, and the player class that it's using is the cookie cutter or the template that we're using to create that. And again, just to clarify, we can have an unlimited number of players. A player Louise equals new. Okay, so two completely separate objects. So they both use their own template, they both use the template to create their own separate and distinct objects. That confused me for a long time, so I hope I've made that clear so that you aren't as confused for as long as I was when I was first learning object-oriented concepts. Okay, so let's extend our player class a little further. Now if we look at our player class again, we've got handle name, lives, level, and score. But you're not restricted to using those types of variables. We can use an object as a type in a class. Now, that will make more sense if I start this. What I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new class called a weapon. So I'm going to go into here, go into my org.example.learn. I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to call it weapon. Okay, and it's going to have a number of properties. This is a weapon, so it's going to have the private string name and private int, and we'll call it damage inflicted, so how much damage it does to a player, and private int hit points, so how strong it is, how many points it takes before it runs out of and breaks basically. And let's use Eclipse and create some methods for us. So we're going to generate the getters and setters. We're just going to select all of them. Okay. And you'll notice that the Eclipse code automatically uses this for the setters, which is good. Okay, so that's that. We'll make a bit of space here. But we also want a constructor. So let's add a constructor as well. Again, using the source code. Constructor using fields. And we're going to say the 3 fields. Select them all, which they are selected. Click on OK. And you can see there again, Eclipse has come to the party and automatically created that for us. I'm going to talk about super later. You don't really need to know too much about that now, because that's got to do with where classes come from and where that sort of subclasses and so forth. We don't need to go into that now, so we'll leave that for now. But you can see again what it's done here. It's a very simple class. We've done this now a few times. It's created a constructor so that we can create a weapon. So I'm going to save that. But what I can do is go back now into player, and I can create a private weapon. Private weapon. So that's going to create a weapon class for the player. So the player is going to have its own weapon. So what I'm going to do is going to put a default option in here to put set default weapon. And we're going to create that class, private class. This dot weapon equals new weapon. And again, the syntax was, we're going to call it, let's just call it a sword. It can inflict 10 points at a time, and it can take 20 hit points before it breaks. So what we've done there is we've initialized this class, the class weapon, with these parameters. So we've said our default weapon is a sword. It can do 10 points of damage every time it's used, and it can take up to 20 points. It's got 20 hit points, in other words, before it breaks. So the last thing we need to do then is set up a constructor for that new weapon. So again, we're using the source code generate getters and setters. We've only got the one. Click OK. And again, you can see what we've got there. Now it has automatically added the code. If we pass it a weapon, we can replace the weapon with a new one, or we can get the weapon to find out what type of weapon the player's got. Clean that up a bit. I'll save that. So we go back to Java. Let's clear out the level, which we don't need in the second player class, player object. But let's do a system.out println tim.get weapon dot get name. Now that's getting a little bit more complex, but you can see what we've done there. So the code is tim.getWeapon. So Tim being a player, so it comes through there and it returns the weapon. So it uses this class here, this method I should say here, get weapon, and it returns the weapon class. And again, the weapon class was initialized up here in our set default weapon. So it should return us a sword. And going back to demo, but then it's got dot get name. So where's that coming from? Well, this is the beauty of object-oriented programming, because the dot get name is coming from here. It's using this class. So it's automatically going into player, retrieving the weapon. It knows that it's a weapon, so therefore it's going to the template definition for weapon and saying, okay, there's a method here called get name. I'm going to use that. So you can chain this sort of as far down as you want to go. Like in other words, weapon could have its own, could have another object. Like maybe it would be a weapon type or something like that. Weapon type or something of that nature, and that could have its own class. But we're not going to go to that much complexity at this stage. But now if we run that, and of course, why do we get an error? Well, the reason we got the error is we haven't initialized the weapon, because we've got a method in here called set name and level Timothy, 5, and if we go back to the player class and check that out, this dot weapon equals new weapon, but of course it didn't call our set default weapon, it didn't call that class never got executed. So what we really need to do, the smart thing to do here, would be to put this in a constructor, in its own constructor, and make sure that that constructor is always called no matter where that class is set up. So the way to do that is to take it out of here, because this is only called if we pass, we call player. What I'll do is I'll just show you that first before we proceed. So if I just comment that out for now. Now this will work if I just type in my parameter, my name is Timothy, save it. If we run this, we should find that works. That's now come back with Timothy and sword, and that's because now we've changed it. This is being executed. But of course in the past, in the previous example, we were calling the empty class, we were calling that class with no parameters. And of course, that hasn't got any sort of set default weapon status. So really all this code here should not be in that class. We should take it out of that method, I should say. That should really be in here as the default. And then what we should do is every time we create a constructor, the first thing we should do is type this. Now what that means is it's always, no matter what, it's always going to call this default player constructor, which means we're going to get initialized. And if we create any other constructors down the track, so long as our first line is this, that means that's always going to get executed. So as you can see, what will happen is if someone calls this constructor, the empty one, that's pretty straightforward. It's going to set the handle of the player to unknown player, lives and level and score, and set a default weapon. But if we pass the name of the player, it's going to call that first. So initially it's going to call, it's going to set handle name to unknown player. And just to be consistent, we really should set that to this. And it's going to go through and execute all of this and set the weapon. But then the next line, it's going to come back to here, and it's then going to set handle name and save the actual handle name that's been assigned. So it'll go from unknown player to whatever we've passed it. So scrolling down here, so this really wasn't the best of ideas to put that there. What we should really have done, if we want to set things up initially, we should be creating a constructor with those parameters. So in other words, we've got one parameter there where we can just assign the name, and it will set these things automatically for us. But we could just as easily have another one, public player string handle comma int level. We still do this, but then we override it. Set handle name and set level. So I hope that's made sense. And if you just play with this for a little while, it'll probably start making a lot more sense. And it is quite normal, particularly as the functionality of a class grows, to have multiple constructors. But what you always want to do is try and make sure that you do your default initialization. That has to happen for every player. You only do that once in here, so we're not duplicating code. Because you can imagine if you had this code and you were duplicating it in these methods. So each time you created a constructor, you put this code in. Well, that's bad because we're duplicating code here. So we've got code sort of in 3 places. So if we decide, okay, by default we want to give the player 5 lives. So you might go through and you'd have to go through multiple places and find out where to do that. But once we set that, you might have forgotten to do this one here. So therefore you've got, it's just increasing the chances of running into a problem. So it's best to do it in one place. So the best way to do that, I'm just going to undo these changes, is to try and put all your initialization that has to occur once for all the times that this is called in the one place, and then call that using this, which that's going to be guaranteed to be executed, and then you override by just doing those subsequent calls after that. Okay, so I'm going to save that. Okay, this video is going on a little bit, so I'm going to pause here and finish off here, and we'll come back and continue in the next video.